Now, legend has it that the Boston neighborhood of Charlestown, aka the Green Square Mile, has produced more bank and armored car robbers than any other square mile in the entire world. The history of Charlestown and its underworld goes much farther back than the prolific bank crews of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, though. Let's take a dive into the legends of one of Boston's most notorious neighborhoods, Charlestown, otherwise known as the Town. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about one of the most notorious Boston neighborhoods, Charlestown. Referred to in the past as the Green Square Mile for its small geographical area and its high concentration of Irish American residents, Charlestown, or the Town, is a much different place today than it once was. The town historically was a very insular place, and the residents had a hard scrabble, blue-collar reputation. Locals did not talk to police, and if you wandered into the town uninvited, it would most likely not end well for you, regardless if you were white or black. Charlestown has always had a tough reputation among Massachusetts people, especially those who live in the greater Boston area, but Ben Affleck's movie The Town introduced the neighborhood to the rest of the world. By the time the movie came out in the early 2000s, the neighborhood was already drastically starting to change. Now in the 2020s, Charlestown is one of the most gentrified neighborhoods in the entire city. A quick jump on the bridge and you're downtown Boston, but you also feel very separate from the rest of the city because of the geography of the neighborhood. The beautiful hills with the tree-lined streets, renovated row houses, and old brick buildings are in high demand for many wealthy young people moving into the city. The movie The Town focused on a criminal subculture that gripped the neighborhood from the 1970s throughout the early 2000s. The specialty of the neighborhood was armed robbery, most notably banks and armored cars, but the last generation was hitting Walgreens and CVS's. It was said by an FBI agent that more bank and armored car thieves had come out of this one particular square mile than any other square mile in the entire world. That's a pretty staggering statistic, but the underworld history of Charlestown goes much farther back than that. Much, much farther back. Before Charlestown was known as the bank and armored car robbery capital of the world, it was run by racketeers like the McLaughlins, a crew of brothers including Bernie, Punchy, and Georgie, along with the Hughes brothers Connie and Stevie, menaced the Charlestown waterfront, posing as members of the International Longshoremen's Association in the late 1940s and 50s. They also did contracts for Italian organized crime. They ran extortion and bookmaking rackets out of the local barrooms, which were always full of longshoremen, sailors, and other men down on their luck. After getting into a beef with guys from Winter Hill and Somerville in the early 1960s, the McLaughlin crew was wiped off the face of the earth entirely, and a new generation began. But the underworld history of Charlestown goes back much farther than even the McLaughlins. Charlestown is a very old place, especially for American standards. It was first settled in 1629 by an Englishman named Thomas Graves with about 100 other settlers. They built a fort up on what they called Fort Hill, which is now known as Town Hill. They named this new settlement Charlestown, after the English king, King Charles I. The peninsula on which they settled already had a name, though. The reason Graves and the other settlers built the fort was because the peninsula now called Charlestown was already inhabited by Indian tribe who had lived there for most likely thousands of years. They called this place Mishawam, which meant place of great springs because of the plentiful fresh water supply. There's a housing project in Charlestown called Mishawam. My buddy and long-term viewer Chris Dandrew grew up there. What's up, bro? I'll give you a quick shout out. I wonder how many people who live there know where their name originally came from. Fun fact for you guys. The next year, 1,000 Puritan settlers came and the settlement quickly grew in size. The original town included everything northwest of the city all the way up to Burlington and Wilmington. Charlestown's rough reputation began much farther back in the 20th century. In 1805, the infamous Charlestown Prison opened its doors to convicts in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Charlestown Prison was a horrific medieval-style dungeon. Just from the outside view alone, it was intimidating, but the inside it was much, much worse. The prison was built on a piece of land called Lynn's Point, right next to where the Bunker Hill Community College now sits. The location was in close proximity to a waterway where they could bring in all the stone used to build the fearsome structure. Granite from the massive Quincy quarries, and I'm not sure why they couldn't use granite from Gloucester or Rockport when everyone knows that Cape Ann granite is the best, far superior to Quincy's granite. Anyways, the granite was used for the actual structure, and then they used field stones from farms in Chelmsford to fill in the massive pit in the middle of the prison, which was 30 feet square by 7 feet deep. This would be the prison yard for the convicts to have their rec time. The original prison had 90 cells, all 9 feet by 8 feet in size. Then in 1829, they built a northern wing of another 304 cells, this time much smaller, 7 feet by 3.5 feet. Think about that, 3.5 feet wide. That's so small, it's crazy. Then in 1850, they built a southern wing with an extra 150 cells. Seems like the criminals of the Commonwealth beginning to multiply. Then in 1878, the prison closed and all the convicts were moved to the brand new Concord Reformatory. Then only 6 years later, they changed Concord into a youth reformatory and moved all the adults back to Charlestown. The prisoners were not happy. In Concord, they had toilets and running water. In Charlestown, they had a water bucket, a waste bucket, a bed, and a table, nothing else. Finally, due to these inhumane conditions in 1955, a huge riot happened in Cherry Hill, which was the worst part of the prison. 4 armed inmates took 5 guards and another 18 inmates hostage. The prisoners tried to dig a tunnel underneath the wall, but like anywhere else in Charlestown, you dig a hole in the ground and it fills up with water automatically. And yes, I accidentally said Concord. I know it's Concord. Relax. After 82 hours of negotiating, the siege was over and no charges were filed. The Massachusetts governor agreed that the conditions in the Charlestown prison were deplorable and inhumane, and no human should be subjected to that. Later that year in 1955, the Charlestown prison shut its doors for good. To be close to their incarcerated relatives, many people permanently moved to Charlestown over the years. Guards and employees of the prison also lived in the town, probably making for some very awkward instances over the years. The Charlestown waterfront was one of the most active waterfronts in Boston as well, and many of the town's residents were employed as longshoremen, stevedores, and lumpers. They were the guys that got all the freight off the big ships that delivered everyday goods to the city. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, everything that people used came by ocean freighter or rail car. They didn't have forklifts or big massive cranes like they do now, so everything was moved by these workers. The waterfront has always been a place where underworld figures mix in with everyday working folk. During Prohibition, ports like Charlestown, South Boston, Eastie, and the North End, where most of the illegal spirits consumed by Boston's residents were coming in. Irish racketeers from Charlestown and Southie, along with the Jewish King Charles Solomon, and the North End's Joseph Lombardo, controlled the majority of Boston's bootlegging rackets. The International Longshoremen's Association, the Union for the Dock Workers, which was one of the strongest in the nation, had members everywhere. The guys in Boston were connected to other ILA members across the country. Unfortunately, the ILA, along with many other legitimate labor unions, were infiltrated by powerful criminals during the late 1920s and 30s, and throughout the 20th century, the mob and unions kind of went hand in hand. With that being said, the working waterfront was a huge part of Charlestown's early identity. Now, I know some of you guys are probably like, alright, enough with the history lesson, let's talk about some street stuff, and I promise you guys just keep watching. I talk about plenty of that stuff. I talk about all the bank robbers and all the different stuff about the Charlestown underworld, but just indulge me for a little bit. Listen, you might actually learn something. So I know some of you guys think this stuff is boring, but some of you guys like the history. I personally love history, so please just indulge me. I promise at the end of the video we'll talk about street stuff. The Charlestown Navy Yard was also one of the neighborhood's staples and largest employers. The Navy Yard was built right around the same time as the prison, opening in 1800, 5 years before the prison was built. These two places were some of the most enduring and memorable landmarks historically in the town. The Navy Yard was built on a giant tidal flat that the British actually used to invade during the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was large enough that they were able to land their giant warships. I bet at one time it was a sweet clam flat for the natives. That's the clam digger in me. Every time I see sand or mud at low tide, I think clams. In 1917, 2 years after the 19th Amendment was passed and women were legally allowed to work, the Navy Yard opened up its doors to female employees. And during World War II, when many of Charlestown's men were serving our country, women made up almost 20% of the Navy Yard's workforce. During that period, the Navy Yard produced more than 6,000 warships for the U.S. That's quite a production jump from the 170 they produced in the Civil War. The Charlestown Navy Yard had more than 50,000 employees at its height, and the waterfront dive bars in Charlestown would be filled to the brim at lunchtime or after work with many thirsty sailors, longshoremen, and other Navy Yard employees. This was quite a period in the town's history. The waterfront was a vibrant, hustling, and bustling place full of activity and life, and more importantly, men and women working. Now the waterfront is mostly luxury condos, and it's a far cry from where the city's past, and this includes other neighborhoods in the city of Boston as well. My great-grandfather Clarence and my great-uncle Chet, my great-great-uncle Chet, I guess, actually closed down their boat shop during World War II and went and volunteered. They probably got paid, but they went and volunteered their services because they were very skilled craftsmen and knew a lot about building boats, and they were too old to serve in the Navy or the Army. My grandfather, my bup, went with his best friend and enlisted like the day after Pearl Harbor, like most young guys did. But his father and his uncle went and worked at the Charlestown Navy Yard, and my grandfather always told me that story as a kid growing up, so I always thought that was pretty cool, so I always heard about the Charlestown Navy Yard. Think it's also important to note another Charlestown activity that I have never ever heard mentioned on YouTube before, and as far as I know, this originated in the town. Looping, or the more familiar term of the people who did the looping, were called loopers. Quick shout out to my man Bill Fitzpatrick, a townie who reached out to me well over a year ago and probably thought I'd never mention loopers. Here you go, buddy. The tradition first began by a young man from the town in 1925 named Jimmy Shiner Sheehan. The young lad of just 16 stole a car in Boston, evaded police and car chases that lasted over a period of several weeks. He continually drove through the loop in Charlestown, down Bunker Hill Street, onto Chelsea Street, then back up Main Street until he looped back onto Bunker Hill and again and again. People kept coming out of their houses and cheering on Shiner as he evaded the police and sped up and down the loop. He was eventually caught and probably, of course, treated very fairly and respectfully by the local cops at BPD Station Number 15 in City Square, Charlestown. After copycat loopers began to race stolen cars up and down the loop in Charlestown, the police dug up the street in 3 separate spots. But still, adolescent townie kids continued on with the tradition, even going so far as to call the police station and challenge patrolmen to come and get them. For the most part, as long as they didn't steal your car, the townies found it amusing, and they would line the streets cheering on the loopers. Public opinion began to sway when an Irish immigrant, Bridget Doherty from Donegal in the far north of the island, was hit by loopers while waiting for a streetcar and passed away. Also, Officer Malloy of the BPD was struck while rolling out a magic carpet, which was rolled up leather belt with 18-inch spikes to pop the tires of the passing loopers' stolen vehicles. Officer Malloy also passed away from the accident. Charlestown has always been very isolated from the rest of the city. It's right across the river from downtown Boston via the north end. The quick ride across the fancy Zakim Bridge has made it desirable to many wealthy new residents. But back in the 20th century and even before, Charlestown's geography kept it relatively isolated from the rest of the city's neighborhoods. Everett, Eastie, and Chelsea sit across Charlestown on the opposite bank of the Mystic River. Sunny Chelsea is easily accessible by the old Tobin Bridge and Route 1. The only land neighbors that Charlestown has are East Cambridge and East Somerville. Interstate 93 basically cuts Charlestown off from its land neighbors, especially Cambridge, and even Somerville, who Charlestown had an epic beef with in the 1960s, really don't have neighborhoods that directly border each other. The majority of Charlestown's residents live in a tiny 1 square mile area on the peninsula. The 3 main streets that run parallel to one another and make up the entirety of the neighborhood are Medford Street, Bunker Hill Street, and Main Street. Then at the bottom of the peninsula you have Chelsea Street, which runs the whole length of the waterfront and connects to all 3 of these main thoroughfares. In 1965, urban renewal came to Charlestown and changed the face of many buildings in the neighborhood, but it's really been gentrification since the early 2000s that's definitely changed Charlestown as we know it. Before we get into the most talked about time period in Charlestown's history, I want to give a local legend a shout out. I'm sure many Massachusetts natives might not even be aware that she's from Charlestown. I wasn't. Mother Goose is actually from Charlestown. Elizabeth Foster married a man named Isaac Vergoose, nicknamed Goose. Her son-in-law then convinced her to publish her now famous nursery rhymes. Fun little fact for you guys. The 1960s were one of the most violent periods in Boston's history. The beef that began between Charlestown and Winter Hill and Somerville ended up causing every single crew in Boston to pick a side. Unfortunately for Charlestown, they were on the losing side. Every single member of their crew except for Spike O'Toole, who was in prison, and Georgie McLaughlin got whacked. Spike ended up getting taken out by the Hill in the 1970s, and Georgie was sentenced to life in prison. Poor Punchy McLaughlin was hunted like an animal, and finally on the 3rd attempt he was put out of his misery. After the McLaughlins, a new generation began in the 1970s. Massachusetts has always been the place of legendary scores. You had the famous Brinks heist of the 1950s, and then the Plymouth mail truck heist of the early 1960s, which were 2 of the biggest robberies in U.S. history at that point. Legendary armed robbers Jack Red Kelly and his partner George, who was nicknamed Aggie, because I, even at half Greek, can't pronounce his last name, so I can see why everyone called him Aggie. This new generation of townies began to follow in the footsteps of these legends, who put together big scores. Banks and armored cars became the criminals from Charlestown's specialty. Anthony Shea, who would go on to become one of the most legendary armed robbers in the history of Charlestown, possibly even the U.S., allegedly said that in the 1970s, when he was younger and was just getting started, he could go down to the corner store in his neighborhood and hang outside. Within an hour, somebody would approach him and ask him to be part of a job or at least a lookout. Let me be clear. Just because Charlestown had more bank and armored car robbers than any other square mile in the world, it was still a small percentage of the population. Most townies were hard-working, blue-collar people. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the town's criminals honed their trade and multiple crews operated the neighborhood. During this time period when many other places were beginning to change in America, most white people had moved from the inner cities. Only a few quote-unquote white ghettos remained. 97% of the town's 15,000 residents were white. Some examples were Charlestown and Southie in Boston, the west side of Manhattan, South Philly were a few of the last on the East Coast. But life could seem very dreary to a young person growing up in public housing in Charlestown during this period. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of opportunities for the future. There was a lot of poverty and violence in the environment that you were raised in. In the late 1970s, narcotics began to enter the neighborhood as well. Some of the biggest traffickers in this period were from the town. Joseph Murray got caught in the 1980s as being part of a conspiracy to smuggle hundreds of tons of bud into the U.S. He had connections all over the world and was one of the biggest traffickers on the East Coast in the 1980s. Also, a particular substance took hold in the town that was only a fad in most places, but stayed in Charlestown: sherm. It became part of the town's lore with bank robber persona. I personally have met plenty of kids from Charlestown at Danvers Cab who say they do it all the time. I don't know. I really don't like that stuff. I don't get it. Other than that, throughout the 1980s and 90s, there were crews of guys that dealt brown and white, especially the Blanco. It's also important to note that during this time period, busing was in full effect and had a huge impact on the landscape of the neighborhood. Most people from outside Boston think of only South Boston, but it affected every part of the city. The thoroughly white and mostly Irish Charlestown had the same experience. Black kids were bused into their schools, and they were bused to theirs. This led to a very tense racial situation in the city of Boston that the media loves to portray to the max. But in September of 1979, a tragic thing did happen in Charlestown. A black teenager from Roxbury was playing football in a high school game when he was paralyzed by a teenager from Charlestown. This teen would later become one of the neighborhood's most feared enforcers, Joe Nardone. Nardone and a couple of his friends were up on a roof of a nearby building. He told police they were hunting pigeons when he accidentally hit Williams. Now, whether or not this is true, I don't know, I wasn't there, but Joe Nardone would go on to commit acts of violence on a regular basis in the future. The teenager Darrell Williams, at only 15 years old, would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life and passed away in 2010. It's just another black eye on Boston's race record. Joseph Nardone would become an enforcer later in the 1980s for what the media would later dub the Code of Silence crew. Michael Fitzgerald was the leader of the crew along with his partner John Houlihan, who ran the operation out of Kerrigan's flower shop, which most likely is the inspiration for the flower store in the movie The Town. These guys had a very legitimate operation going. Fitzgerald gave all his dealers pages and all their customers had specific codes. They weren't supposed to serve people who paged a random number. The dealers needed to give you a specific code number. Joseph Nardone, who was described as a squat, bull-necked man, was in charge of handling the rough stuff. Fitzgerald described him as the headache man. By the late 1980s into the 90s, with the violence all over Boston spinning out of control, Charlestown was no different. From 1975 to 1992, there was 49 bodies in the town, and 33 of those cases remained unsolved, an example of the strict code of silence. Fitzgerald's operation was wildly lucrative, but like all trafficking operations, it's the violence that brings the authorities' attention, and this crew had no shortage of that. James Boyden IV began selling Blanco on Jenny Rose Lynch's territory, who was Fitzgerald's girlfriend. He was told to cease and desist, but he wouldn't listen. Fitzgerald wasn't going to tolerate that, so a henchman took Boyden out soon after in March of 92. Then only 10 weeks later in May of 92, his father, James Boyden III, was whacked by the crew's henchmen as well. Apparently he wanted retribution for his son's death, which Fitzgerald could not tolerate. Then in 92, George Sargent, who was a member of Fitzgerald's operation, was arrested twice for dealing. Both times he willingly talked to police about dealing in bodies. He gave evidence on Fitzgerald and Houlihan, but was afraid of Nardone and refused to even say his name. After discovering his treachery, Houlihan and Fitzgerald ordered Nardone to take out Sargent. In June of 1992, George Sargent was clipped in front of his home by none other than Joe Nardone. In response to this, longtime runner and associate of the crew, William Bud Sweeney, questioned Houlihan about Sargent's death. This was obviously unacceptable. In the next few months, Sweeney had 3 attempts on his life, the last one leaving him paralyzed from the chest down. By this point, the violence was completely out of control in Charlestown's streets, and the authorities were dead set on shutting this operation down. But in order to do that, the feds would need to crack Charlestown's thick code of silence, which at this time seemed like an unattainable goal. I just thought it was important to highlight a crew like Fitzgerald and Houlihan's when most people think about bank and armored car robbers from the town, but crews like this and this activity were prevalent as well. Around this time, another Charlestown legend was running amok in the town, Arthur Butchie Doe. Butchie Doe got involved in a little bit of everything. He dealt, he robbed dealers, he robbed bank and armored cars, and he robbed bank and armored car robbers. Fair to say, Butchie made more than a few enemies. In 1989, Butchie and one of his few friends, Jojo Burho, would get clipped in Charlestown. Butchie got severely injured, being hit in the neck and the head, but he and Jojo would survive, but unfortunately the female that was present did not. Apparently they were inside an apartment when masked men entered forcefully and carried out the attack. This allegedly happened because Butchie stole a package of Brown and a package of Sherm from a local dealer. Apparently, this was one of Butchie's favorite combos before he got clean later in life. Then later in the same year, in 1989, Butchie was clipped again, this time in front of a local sub shop. He again survived. This time, the reason for the attack was because allegedly Butchie decided after a really successful bank score that he didn't want to split the proceeds with his partners and kept all the money for himself. Oh, Butchie. After serving a prison sentence for selling Brown, Butchie got his life together and passed away from cancer in 2008 while living peacefully in Wakefield, Mass. At the age of 58. One of Butchie's main enemies back in the 80s and 90s was also one of the town's most prolific bank and armored car bandits, Anthony Shea. Shea was a member of one of the most famous crews to ever come out of the town, which the media portrayed as the No Name Gang. The No Name Gang, as the media dubbed them, consisted of 5 men later all sentenced to life in prison for their roles in one of the most prolific crews to ever come out of Charlestown. Anthony Shea, Stephen Burke, Patrick McGonigal, Michael Halloran, and Matthew McDonald. Anthony Shea, who had been a stick-up kid since the 1970s, linked up with Matthew McDonald and a man named Dick Donovan and began robbing banks as a crew in 1990. Then in 92, Shea and McDonald linked up with Stephen Burke and Michael O'Halloran. John Burke, Stephen's brother, was also a member of the crew, but he would end up betraying everyone and doing the unthinkable. Later in the year of 92, the crew changed their focus from robbing banks to armored cars, and as they like to call them in Charlestown, bread trucks. These guys went on a magnificent run over the next 2 years, hitting dozens of scores all over the place in mass cities like Fall River, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, even all the way down to West Palm Beach, Florida. These guys make millions of illicit dollars during their run, although it's not always easy to enjoy the spoils as depicted in the movie The Town. Now this brings up a good point. It's rumored this crew was the inspiration for the book by Chuck Hogan called Prince of Thieves, which if you haven't read that book, go out and do it now. I read it when I was in Middleton back in the day, and it's one of my favorite reads. Many people think Ben Affleck made the movie The Town off the idea of Prince of Thieves. But by 1994, the crew's unmatched streak ended when trying to take down a bread truck in Hudson, New Hampshire on August 24, 1994. 2 armed guards ended up losing their lives. After the terrible crime, they drove the truck to an abandoned area in the woods and left the guards in the truck and fled the scene. After the vicious crime, the feds put all their resources into trying to find the culprits. It didn't take them very long to figure out the men who committed this crime were from Charlestown. After combing the neighborhood and pressing certain people, they were pretty sure they knew who it was. In fact, they knew who exactly it was. The thing was, they couldn't prove it. The crew was so good that they never left a piece of physical evidence at any one of the multiple crime scenes or the getaway cars. And no one in the town would go on record and testify against them. That's how strong the code of silence was in Charlestown. The crew who had been so flawless early on was beginning to get sloppy. The Hudson, New Hampshire job was evidence of that. I've always heard one of the main reasons for this was that some of the members of the crew, notably Shea himself, were avid users, even being strung out on H. I've also heard that John Burke was a regular H user. In some of the most watched docs about Shea and the crew on channels like A&E, they state this as fact, but I've heard in different Reddit chats and people in the comments of my videos say that Shea did not use at all, so I'm really not sure what to believe. I've never spoken to him personally. Just want to put that out there. Well, either way, they began to take more chances and the pressure from law enforcement was getting to them. Exactly a year after the Hudson, New Hampshire job, in Londonderry, New Hampshire, a few men tried to rob a bank. They broke a window to gain entry into the bank but missed the time lock on the vault. Upon exit, one man cut himself on the window and the authorities were able to use the blood on the glass to get a DNA match. It was only 1995 though, and DNA was a brand new science. It would take weeks for the sample to come back. In the meantime, the feds descended on Charlestown. They stalked Shea and the other members of the crew, watching their every move 24/7. The other members of the crew sat idle, but Shea kept on doing what he did best. The police followed Shea as he seemed to be getting ready to do a score. He entered a stolen vehicle and stashed it in a strategic location. Then the feds followed Shea as he went to rendezvous with 2 other men who weren't part of his usual crew. Younger Charlestown guys, I believe, at a hotel in Peabody. I love listening to guys on channels like A&E pronounce Peabody. Peabody! As Shea and his accomplices were about to rob a bank in downtown suburban Wakefield, the feds pounced and arrested the men. Shea decided to go out peacefully instead of banging it out on the streets. A few weeks later, the DNA came back as a match, and Shea was cooked. As the trial began, John Burke did the unthinkable and flipped against the others. Not only was informing the worst thing possible to do in the town, but it was unimaginable to inform on your own brother. The code of silence that had begun back in the Prohibition or even before on the waterfront carried through the entire 20th century was beginning to crumble in the town. Not only with John Burke, but at Fitzgerald, Houlihan, and Nardone's trial, the Fed spent over $1 million protecting witnesses and had 6 residents relocated. Almost a dozen criminals were granted immunity and given new identities for their testimony at trial. I guess the majority of the residents in the town had become sick of the violence and intimidation by criminals. By the early 2000s, the old Charlestown was on the brink of death. The last wave of true townies that had any part of this outlaw mentality and lore were in this time period. I made a video about this particular period when I first started my channel like over a year ago. It didn't get many views initially, then like 6 months ago it jumped from 5,000 views to 30,000 views, and a person that I mentioned contacted me. The video was taken down by YouTube very soon after. Now, that conversation was friendly enough, I'm not saying it was him, but what a coincidence. I'm going to briefly and carefully talk about this because I don't want that to happen again. But all I know is when I was in Middleton in the summer of 2001, literally almost every other night on the news, a CVS or Walgreens or a store of that nature was being robbed for a specific product. The vast majority of those kids were from Charlestown. So instead of doing banks, they were hitting these stores now. A lot of them were doing it in Essex County, so after they were on the news, a couple days later, you'd see them walking through the courtyard and going to Newman. It was wild. By 2002, they were putting signs up in all the windows of these stores saying, "This product is by special order only. Like, please don't rob us." The weird thing is, though, that the kid who made the movie about it was in jail with me that year, and he had a much longer sentence than me. He was my barber, and he gave good fades, by the way. But I'm not sure how he could have been involved in all that when he was locked up. Plus, he lived in Gloucester for most of the late 90s, not in Charlestown. That's how I knew him. But what do I know? Either way, it was a crazy final chapter in the outlaw bandit saga of the town. By the 2010s, gentrification was in full effect. All the little funky row houses and brick buildings with the hilly tree-lined streets with awesome views of downtown Boston. It was prime real estate for people with money moving into the city. During this period, a lot of middle-class and working-class people in Boston moved out. Rents began to soar as more and more people with money began to move in. The younger generation had been hit especially hard by the disease that fueled the store robberies of the early 2000s. Deaths and hospitalizations from OCs at H was 50% higher in Charlestown than the rest of Boston. Many of the middle class and blue collar residents of Charlestown moved to the metro northwest suburbs like Wakefield, Stoneham, Reading, and Wilmington, even all the way up to Billerica and Tewksbury. This is similar to the Irish from Southie moving down to Quincy and other South Shore towns and cities because of gentrification. There are obviously still townies that have held on and live in Charlestown, but overall the neighborhood is unrecognizable. Even in the 90s, if a North Shore boy like me walked into Charlestown alone and unwelcomed, I'd be leaving with a black eye in the best case scenario, most likely. But now you can take the orange line and get off and walk around and no one's really going to bother you. There's still some rough projects in Charlestown, but overall it's pretty much been fully gentrified. I hope you guys enjoyed this rundown of some of the most enduring legends from one of Boston's most notorious neighborhoods. Hope you guys enjoyed the mix of mob and crime tales along with the history. I try to tell the whole story of Charlestown because there's a lot more to the town than just bank robbers and armored car robbers. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I tried to tell the whole story or both sides of the story of Charlestown. I know a lot of people when they talk about that neighborhood or its past, they like to focus on the negative stuff and just the criminal subculture that existed there. But like I said earlier in the video, that was only a small percentage of the population. The majority of people from Charlestown were hardworking, blue-collar, honest people. And I just wanted to tell a little bit of the history as well. I always try to mix in some history with like the street stuff and crime and mob stuff. And I know a lot of people like it, and hey man, you know, if I can teach you guys something or you can learn something while watching this video, that's awesome. I just love history, and I try to mix it in with all this stuff, and I just want to make it not all negative criminal stuff like this is all Charlestown was, because Charlestown has a rich history. Like I said, it's basically ancient for American standards. So if you like this video, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, but most importantly guys, make good choices, make good decisions. Take good care of yourselves, your family, your friends, your fellow human beings. Have a nice day. I'll talk to you guys soon. God bless. Just so you guys know, I'm filming this in my dirty, messy living room because my daughter's sleeping in the other room, so try not to wake her up.